Well everyone, we've made it. These are the bottom tiers of the Project Apollo Iceberg. Bear in mind, with these being the most obscure items, there may not be much to say about each individual item. With that said, if you haven't watched the first parts, pause this, do that now, and here we go. Living in a CSM. This is a cool thing I didn't know about, which occurred early in the Apollo program before manned flights were being performed. One of the things that needed to be verified in order to make the Apollo hardware flight-worthy was whether or not it could support a crew in the environment of space. So how do you do that without actually sending it to space? Well, you construct a thermal vacuum chamber, put the CSM in it, and put the astronauts in the CSM. Then you remove all of the air pressure from the room, and then you wait. Also, you blast some bright lights at it to simulate unfiltered sunlight. This was done twice prior to Apollo 1 with two different crews. An unmanned test was performed first, ironing out certain kinks like a leak in the CM's side crew hatch and ice buildup in the water system. Then, Donald R. Garrett, Joel M. Rosenwig, and Neil B. Anderson entered a CSM for a second crude thermal test, remaining inside for 182 hours. During this time, the test was delayed by a problem with the emergency repressurization system of the vacuum chamber, an issue with the chamber's solar simulators resulted in several holds, and the urine dump line froze, forcing the crew to store their waste on board. Condensation formed on the CM's windows as water condensed between the layers of the glass panes, and frozen water blocked the fuel cell's hydrogen purge line. During a thunderstorm that even the crew was able to hear, the CSM lost power, forcing them to don their spacesuits. The power returned a few minutes later, and the crew realized that they had all been trying to put on different parts of the same suit in the dark. They were all greatly relieved when they were able to finally leave after just over a week inside. After the test, a laundry list of hardware changes were put forth and implemented, and a second test was scheduled. At the request of Mercury astronaut and Director of Flight Crew Operations Deke Slayton, one of the crew members, Joseph P. Kerwin, was a medical doctor chosen to better keep track of the crew's health. He was joined by Joseph Galliano and Edward Givens for the second test in October of 1966, which experienced much more minor issues over a similar week-long period and paved the way for manned flights to take place. Skylab Gemini hatch. Exiting the Skylab orbital workshop by way of the airlock module required utilizing a hatch from a Gemini spacecraft. Despite Skylab being a mostly Apollo-era design, this hatch is a prime example of one of the ways NASA frequently appears to cut down on program costs: hardware reuse. The hatch was sold to politicians as a way to make Skylab seem more affordable, but in reality, using the Gemini hatch required serious redesign work. The airlock module had been designed as a cylinder, and the Gemini hatch was built as part of a conical structure. The hatch wound up being placed on the side of the airlock module, and you can practically see all of the better options that were ignored in order to maintain a thrifty public image. NASA used to be very clever about this kind of stuff. Apollo Venus flyby. Oh yeah, this was a real idea. The manned Venus flyby was a 1967 proposal to send 3 astronauts on a flyby mission of the planet Venus. It was part of the Apollo Applications program, which aimed to develop scientific human spaceflight missions using hardware developed for the Apollo program. This was a wacky time in NASA's history, and some of the AAP ideas are pretty out there. We'll talk about more of them, but at the end of the day, the only part of the AAP that would survive the severe slashes to the post-Apollo budget would be Skylab, as well as the Apollo telescope mount on Skylab, and honestly that's probably for the best, though it is fun to imagine an Apollo CSM flying past Venus. About that. The plan was to use a Saturn V to send the crew on a year-long flight, which required the S4B, the third stage, to be used as a wet workshop. What is a wet workshop? I'm so glad you asked. The idea is simple, yet at the same time extremely complicated. Use a large upper stage to reach your destination, then while in space, convert those spent fuel tanks into a habitable module for long-duration spaceflights. Skylab itself was originally conceptualized as a wet workshop, but would instead be converted into a habitable module before launch and be ready for use as soon as it reached orbit. So the plan was to use the S4B as living quarters and a workshop after the remaining propellant was vented into space, using the smaller oxygen tank as waste storage. A lot of the equipment for conversion would be placed inside the tank itself, while pieces that would not survive immersion in liquid hydrogen would be placed inside the S4B interstage, usually reserved for a lunar lander. For course corrections, the Apollo Service propulsion system was replaced with 2 side-mounted LM descent propulsion systems. There's a lot more to say about the manned Venus flyby, but honestly it might require its own video as it's pretty extensive. It never happened, and honestly that's probably for the best. There are so many ways it could have gone horribly wrong. The Golden Olive Branch. There are a lot of sentimental and symbolic items left on the moon by the Apollo astronauts. One of these is a gold olive branch, a traditional symbol of peace, less than half a foot in length, left on the surface by Neil Armstrong during Apollo 11, though I can't find any information about exactly where or when it was placed, though I can confirm it wasn't placed near the plaque due to a photo we'll see later. Even more frustrating, there doesn't seem to be a single photo of the real branch on the moon, just this replica. Continuing the theme of frustration, you may have heard an internet rumor that the Apollo spacesuit was designed by none other than famous bra makers Playtex, which seems silly at first but actually makes a lot of sense when you think about it. However, the truth, as usual, isn't as interesting. Playtex is a modern name for the ILC, or International Latex Corporation. The ILC initially made a variety of latex products, from swimwear and baby pants to girdles and bathing caps, but during World War II became a key contractor for attack boats, life rafts, and canteens. In 1947, the ILC split into 4 divisions, one of which would become ILC Dover, initially a metals division. In 1965, NASA put out a contract for the Apollo program to design, manufacture, and test a next-generation lunar spacesuit. Other prospective contractors included Hamilton Standard, who would end up making the life support backpacks for the Apollo program, and B.F. Goodrich, who had made the Mark IV spacesuits of Project Mercury. However, ILC Dover won the contract and proceeded to do their best to provide a suit that was not only functional and safe, but provided a new degree of flexibility that would be required while walking on the moon. The company would go on to make the modern extravehicular mobility units in conjunction with Hamilton Standard for the Space Shuttle and International Space Station spacewalks, and would also design the airbag system used to land the Mars Pathfinder, Spirit, and Opportunity missions. So, at the end of the day, did a bra maker make the Apollo spacesuits? Well, technically yes, but that bra maker also made canteens, military boats, industrial protective suits, hazmat suits, M40 and M42 field masks, and a lot more. People tend to forget that a lot of large corporations have a wide array of products they produce. Does anyone remember this ad by Chrysler? The Apollo 5 anomalies. Apollo 5 was the first uncrewed test flight of the LEM, which launched on a Saturn 1B in 1967 after significant delays. The objective was to verify the operational capabilities of the LEM, including testing both the descent and ascent engines. In particular, they wanted to do what they called a fire in the hole test, which involved firing the ascent engine while the 2 stages were still attached to one another. This is a requirement that would be involved in the event of an aborted lunar landing. The descent stage would be shut down, power and control quickly switched to the ascent stage, and the ascent engine would be fired before the 2 were separated. Extra testing involved verifying that the LM engines could be restarted after their first burn, as well as testing the instrument unit of the launch vehicle in its Saturn V configuration, despite this being a Saturn 1B launch. However, as usual with the early phases of these kinds of old programs, everything didn't quite go as planned. The LM separated from its adapter 43 minutes into the flight, and after 2 orbits, the first of 2 burns was started. Intending to last 39 seconds, the engine suddenly shut down after only 4 seconds when the Apollo guidance computer detected insufficient velocity. It was eventually realized that this occurred because the engine's valves weren't armed until it was time to ignite the engine, which meant that there was a lag while the propellant was flowing through the valves. Had such a thing occurred on a crewed mission, flight controllers believed the astronauts could have analyzed the situation and found a fix if necessary. The flight proceeded with the fire in the hole test, completing all required burns despite serious communications difficulties, knowing that if this test wasn't completed, Project Apollo would be delayed even further than it already had been. After 8 hours, a problem with the guidance computer resulted in the entire craft spinning out of control, but by then, all objectives had been achieved and the flight was a complete success. The LEM was left to spin for a few more days before it burned up in the Earth's upper atmosphere. The Apollo 1 mission patch. While we covered the tragedy of Apollo 1 in the first part, remember that it was only called Apollo 1 after the fact. Officially, at the time, the mission was designated AS-204. However, the name of Apollo 1 was thought up well before the incident, and we can tell because the crew can be seen wearing the patch. They designed it, much like every other Apollo mission patch was designed by the crew, focusing on the orbital element, as it was supposed to be the first orbital flight of the program. There was some question at the time of design as to whether or not the name Apollo 1 would stick, resulting in NASA Administrator George Low withdrawing approval for the patch, stating that it may need to be revised if the mission designation was changed. An interesting side note is that the actual artist of the patch, Alan Stevens of Rockwell International, was largely unknown until 2008. Stevens retired in 1978, and at the time, his name wasn't widely publicized with the release of the mission patches. He passed away in 1994, and a space history enthusiast named Noah Bradley purchased a box on eBay that contained a number of Stevens' documents, including the mission patches. From then on, it became publicly available knowledge that Alan Stevens was responsible for the patches of Apollo 1, 7, 9, and 10. J002E3. On September 3, 2002, amateur astronomer Bill Young discovered an unusual object in space. Initially believing it to be an asteroid, the object was designated J002E3, and it was quickly realized that the object was orbiting Earth. This is the unusual part, as the Moon is the only large object orbiting the Earth, and anything else would have been ejected out of the Earth-Moon system by perturbations of gravity caused by the Earth, Moon, and the Sun. Therefore, it was likely that J002E3 had entered orbit of Earth relatively recently. Study of the object began, examining its orbital path and tracing it back through time. J002E3 had been orbiting the Earth for 31 years, and had last been near Earth in 1971. Spectrographic examination revealed that it was definitely not an asteroid, as the evidence suggested it had the same light-absorbing properties as aluminum, black paint, and white paint. It was part of a Saturn V. In fact, it is almost definitely the S4B from Apollo 12. Originally believing the object to be from Apollo 14, NASA stated they knew where all hardware from Apollo 14 is, so it couldn't be, especially not the S4B, which had been crashed into the Moon and registered on the Apollo 12 seismometer experiment. The Apollo 12 S4B, however, was sent into orbit of the Sun, or so NASA had thought. An extra long burn of the ullage motors, which are used to push fuel toward the aft end of the rocket, meant that venting the remaining fuel didn't actually give the S4B enough energy to be ejected out of the Earth-Moon system, instead simply being sent into a very high and very unstable orbit around the Earth. In June of 2003, J002E3 appeared to leave Earth orbit and enter its intended solar orbit, but it may return sometime in the mid-2040s. It's entirely possible that one day, that S4B might re-enter the Earth's atmosphere. However, with a mass of around 14 tons, it's entirely insignificant, as objects that size burn up in Earth's atmosphere roughly 10 times a year, with almost nothing surviving to ever reach the ground. Cernan's lunar initials. Returning to the subject of unusual things left on the Moon, Gene Cernan was the last human being to walk on the Moon, stepping back into the LEM for the last time on December 13, 1972. However, before doing so, he bent down in the lunar dust, stuck his finger into it, and carefully etched 3 letters, TDC, the initials of his daughter Tracy. A popular belief was that he had carved the initials into a rock on the Moon, but he didn't really need to. With no atmosphere to blow the dust around, the letters are very likely still on the Moon to this day, right where Cernan had left them, assuming they were far enough away from the LEM to not get blasted by the ascent stage. The Genesis Rock. Officially named Sample 15415, the Genesis Rock was retrieved from Spur Crater on the Moon by Apollo 15 astronauts Jim Irwin and David Scott during the second DVA. It's one of the oldest lunar samples recovered during Apollo, and was originally thought to be a piece of the Moon's primordial crust. It was later discovered to be around 4.1 billion years old, and formed after the Moon's crust had solidified. However, it remains an interesting geological find, as its composition is that of an anorthosite, a type of igneous rock that are not fully understood even on Earth, their formation being somewhat mysterious in the geology world. Speaking of geology, "It's orange" was the exclamation made by Jack Schmitt on Apollo 17 upon discovering a spot of lunar soil that was, you guessed it, colored orange.
Oh, hey! Wait a minute. What? Where are the reflections? I've been fooled once. There is orange soil. Well, don't move it till I see it. It's all over. Orange! Don't move it till I see it. I've stirred it up with my feet. Hey, it is! I can see it from here. It's orange. Wait a minute, let me put my visor up. It's still orange. Sure it is. Crazy. Orange.
Found at Shorty Crater, which is located roughly right here, the glass-like orange regolith was later identified as a pyroclastic deposit, otherwise known as the result of volcanic activity. The material is around 3.6 billion years old, and is a relic from a time on the Moon that is older than the dinosaurs, just sitting there on the surface waiting for us to find it. Also, can we take a moment and appreciate the childlike wonder and excitement in the astronauts' voices as they found it? Replay that tape.
There is orange soil. It's all over. Orange. Hey, it is. I can see it from here. It's orange. Wait a minute, let me put my visor up. It's still orange. Orange. I've got to dig a trench, Houston.
Are you ready for the shortest item on this entire iceberg? Here we go. Buzz's mom's maiden name. Buzz Aldrin's mother was born Marion Moon. just one of those weird little coincidences like the fact that the fastest man in the world just happens to be named Bolt. The Moon Museum. Back to the subject of weird things left on the moon, this one is only a maybe. The Moon Museum is a small piece of ceramic only 3/4 of an inch in width, containing 6 pieces of, art from prominent artists of the 1960s. Allegedly, the ceramic was secretly attached to the leg of the Intrepid lander on Apollo 12, though the astronauts never confirmed if it was actually there. After the end of the Apollo program, a number of technicians came forward and confessed that, in the layers of gold blankets which wrapped much of the LEM descent stage, they had placed small personal artifacts to be taken to the moon, but the museum was out in the open. Sculptor Forrest Myers, one of the 6 artists, was behind the idea and tried to get the project sanctioned by NASA. While he never got actual approval, he was also never actually told no, and ended up smuggling the museum to the LEM through a Grumman engineer he was friends with. While technically the first piece of art on the moon, most of it isn't very good, likely due to the small amount of canvas the artist had to work with, and I'm also going to take this opportunity to mention that I hate Andy Warhol. I think he's a hack fraud, and it's annoying that because of him, there's now probably a drawing of a dick on the moon that looks like a 12-year-old drew it. SPS/AJ-10 engine. Take a quick look at the service propulsion system, the engine on the bottom of the Apollo service module. Now take a quick look at the 2 orbital maneuvering systems engines on the back of Space Shuttle Discovery. And now, take a look at the bottom of the Orion spacecraft during Artemis 1 in 2022. You may have deduced this by now, but these are all effectively the same engine. The Rocketdyne AJ-10 is one of the most versatile rocket engines in spaceflight history, being first developed for the second stage of the Vanguard rocket, and then later being uprated for the Atlas Able and Thor Able rocket, the former of which launched the Pioneer probes towards the moon. It was then uprated again and used for the Titan III's upper stage, and then once more for the Apollo service propulsion system. This was the first time the engine used Aerozine 50 for fuel and nitrogen tetroxide for oxidizer, as previous iterations used nitric acid and unsymmetrical dimethylhydrazine. Both are hypergolic fuels, allowing them to be stored at room temperature, making them ideal for longer duration spaceflights. As a result, they again became the obvious choice for the shuttle's OMS engines, which would need to make correction and deorbit burns throughout the course of a 2-week mission. When the shuttle was retired, and what would eventually become the Artemis program tried to make use of any leftover hardware, the AJ-10 was chosen yet again, this time actually repurposing the shuttle's OMS engines for use as the Orion main engine. The Artemis 1 OME flew 19 times on 3 different orbiters, Challenger, Atlantis, and Discovery, and the Artemis 2 OME flew 6 times on Space Shuttle Atlantis. The AJ-10 is in many ways the workhorse of American launch vehicles and spacecraft, being there from the very beginning and sticking with us until this very day. Jack Black's mom. You may be surprised to learn that Judith Love Cohen, mother of Hollywood actor and musician Jack Black, was an aerospace engineer who worked for North American Aviation and Space Technology Laboratories, which was later acquired by Northrop Grumman. Her work across her impressive career included the guidance computer for the Minuteman missile and the abort guidance system of the Apollo lunar module. This computer ended up playing a crucial role in the safe return of Apollo 13, as it was the best available system to use most of the return trip given the power constraints of the situation. While her work clearly was amazing and helped enable the safe return of the astronauts, there's one urban legend about all of this that simply isn't true. This meme here states that Cohen was working an Apollo 13 problem when she went into labor, and after giving birth to Jack Black, sent the fix to NASA. There's one simple problem with this. Apollo 13 occurred in April of 1970, and Jack Black was born on August 28, 1969. The Apollo 7 Mutiny. It seems that those earlier vacuum tests didn't quite iron out all of the kinks that would occur on longer duration Apollo flights. Apollo 7, the first crewed flight to occur after the disastrous Apollo 1, was practically a live stress test, requiring the astronauts to remain in the CSM for nearly 11 days. The crew was Commander Wally Schirra, veteran of the Mercury program, Command Module pilot Don Isley, and Lunar Module pilot Walter Cunningham, even though this flight didn't actually carry a lunar module. Liftoff of Apollo 7 went according to plan, despite high winds, as did the first few objectives, including rendezvous with the S-4B after it drifted away, and firing the SPS engine for the first time. Wally Schirra developed a cold, and his previous wishes to abort due to the high winds caused a tug-of-war over command decisions for the rest of the mission. The crew didn't like the sleep schedule, as it required someone to be awake at all times, making it difficult for the other two to rest, or for the one to be very productive. The mission's first television broadcast was delayed again to make way for the mission's primary objectives. Schirra said, quote, "You've added 2 burns to this flight schedule, and you've added a urine water dump, and we have a new vehicle up here, and I can tell you at this point, TV will be delayed without any further discussion until after the rendezvous." On day 8, Mission Control asked the crew to try a new procedure with the guidance computer, which caused it to freeze. The astronauts blamed this on Mission Control, as well as other things such as the craft's stability in orbit, the decision to keep helmets off during re-entry, and more. Flight Director Christopher Kraft called their behavior insubordination and demanded an explanation from Schirra. He later said, quote, "Schirra was exercising his commander's right to have the last word, and that was that." Despite the difficulties, Apollo 7 was a complete success in terms of achieving its goals, and paved the way for Apollo 8 and the impending success of landing a man on the moon. That's Tier 6 done. 2 more to go. Into obscurity we go. I'm not even going to explain the next tier's name, I'm just going to say, watch For All Mankind. Regardless of how you feel about the later directions it takes, that first season is kind of a masterpiece. S-tier television. AJ260. Another one of those things that might have been cool, but never quite made it off the ground. The Aerojet 260 was an experimental solid rocket motor constructed and tested in the mid-1960s as a possible first stage of a Saturn 1B, which would significantly uprate its performance. At an absurd 17.6 meganewtons of thrust and named for the diameter of its chamber, just over 21 feet across, it is the single largest rocket motor ever tested. The tests were performed from a new facility in Florida, and reportedly, the tests were so massive and bright that they could be seen from Miami, 31 miles away. However, the engine was never selected for use by anyone, and after its third and final test, was left abandoned in its firing pit. As of the 1990s, it was still there, but as the source I got this from is 30 years out of date, I would not be surprised if it had been removed by now. S1D SSTO. This is where I need to admit I made a mistake building this iceberg. The S1D is the designation of the booster on the Saturn 5B, which we discussed in the previous episode. So, oops. I guess all I'll mention is that when proposed, the S1D was advertised as an SSTO, or a single stage to orbit. This isn't quite true though, since it would drop 4 of its engines and the skirt during ascent. The plan was to reuse these engines through parachute recovery, but it's still technically not an SSTO. The more appropriate term would be stage and a half, much like the old Atlas booster. Kennedy's doubts. We often talk about President Kennedy and how his charismatic speeches did a lot of heavy lifting for Project Apollo. He said we'd choose to go to the moon before the decade is out, and after his death in 1963, everyone involved in the program worked hard to honor that wish. However, what we don't talk about often is his uncertainty about the program, which was expressed much more privately. In a closed-door cabinet meeting on November 21, 1962, Kennedy voiced a number of concerns that were secretly recorded and later transcribed. Quote, "We're talking about these fantastic expenditures which wreck our budget and all these other domestic programs, and the only justification for it, in my opinion, to do it in this time or fashion, is because we hope to beat them and demonstrate that starting behind, as we did a couple years, by God, we pass them." His primary concern seemed to be priorities, feeling that the large expenditures of Apollo completely dwarfed more immediate problems at home, but the recording also highlighted that overall, Kennedy didn't see very much value in the American space program beyond political value. "We choose to go to the moon not because it's scientifically important, but because we can beat the Soviets to it. It's just one of those subtle reminders that no politician should ever be really, truly deified." Keyhole surgery. Thank you to Scott Manley for this iceberg item and for the information on it. This refers to a solution for something that happened on Apollo 11. You may recall that Apollo 11 landed with a very small amount of fuel remaining in the descent stage, though it turns out the actual amount was somewhat exaggerated. As the propellant sloshed around in the fuel tanks, the low end of the fuel met the low fuel sensor, causing it to trigger around 30 seconds early. A fix was implemented in the form of a cylindrical perforated baffle, but the lunar module for Apollo 14 had already been assembled. The time crunch of the Apollo program wouldn't allow for them to completely disassemble and reassemble the LEM. The solution? Roll the thin, malleable metal of the baffle up as tight as possible, fit it through a 2.5-inch hole in the bottom of the tank, and then once inside, it would pop out and then be assembled and properly fitted from outside of the tank. An impressive feat of very precise surgery on a very complicated machine, and it worked. The new baffle effectively mitigated false readings from propellant slosh. Winged Apollo. Look at it. Just look at it. This was a concept patented in 1967 for a shuttle-like vehicle created out of the Apollo Command and Service Module. It would use a pair of wings that folded into the sides of the service module to assist with glide, and would also drop off the SPS engine bell, leaving a smaller nozzle better suited for lower altitudes. Its forward landing gear was a wheel, but the main gear at the back was a pair of landing skids much like the X-15. It would function effectively like a miniature space shuttle, with most of the service module converted into a cargo bay for payload delivery and satellite servicing. But the real question, would this thing even fly? No, absolutely not. Well, maybe? A lot of people were skeptical of the space shuttle's ability to glide, and while it did fall like a brick, it still hit the runway more or less like a normal plane. So maybe this idea wasn't so crazy after all. Unfortunately, we'll never know, as it never left paper. Jumper cables. Another contribution from Mr. Manley. This was a procedure that was meant to jumpstart the ascent engine of the lunar module, the design of which focused on working absolutely every single time. Should all of that complex design work fail and the engine be unable to start, there were cables called ED adapter cables that could be connected to batteries on the LEM that aren't intended to power the ascent stage, but could, theoretically, power the engine. The whole procedure is very intricate and cautious, and I'll be honest, Scott's video covers it much better, but I will mention this part. The procedure ended by needing to have the LEM surface access hatch opened to space when the ascent engine fires, with the jumper cables hanging out the door.
So when the time comes and they launch, they will obviously fire all the explosive devices, sever the module, it will take off, and they will be flying into space with the hatch open, kind of like driving down the highway with your window open for extra ventilation, except this is the reverse. You've got cables will be dangling out the bottom.
Absolute space cowboy stuff. The smell of the moon. What exactly does the surface of the moon smell like? And of course, how exactly can you smell something in a place that you can't breathe?
Okay, Magazine Bravo is going on the commander's camera. I just tried to blow off the dust, Tony.
Well, obviously, you bring some of it back inside with you. After Apollo 11 had gathered its first lunar samples and stored them in the LEM, Neil and Buzz took off their helmets. They were immediately met with a, quote, pungent metallic smell, something like gunpowder or the smell in the air after a firecracker has gone off. Why does it smell like that? Not entirely certain. It's possible that the smell was activated by the oxygen inside the lander, since reactions with oxygen are what create combustion smells here on Earth. On a basic level, it makes sense to me. We're talking about rocks that have been pulverized into tiny pieces of almost glass by millions of years of impacts, and baking in unfiltered solar radiation. Of course it smells like something exploded there. Why wouldn't it? A16 no-circ burn. This refers to something that happened on Apollo 16 after the lunar module had undocked from the CSM and was preparing for landing. A number of problems occurred. First, the LEM's high-gain antenna stopped responding on its yaw axis, something that was never fixed, as well as a problem with the RCS thrusters. As soon as these issues had been dealt with, Ken Mattingly aboard the CSM found a new problem. The service propulsion system's backup gimbal, when he had tested it, caused the spacecraft to shake violently. Something was very wrong, and at the time, the crew was on the lunar far side, unable to communicate with mission control. The ground rules as they stood were that the CSM would not perform a circularization burn at this time and would instead do a, quote, brute force rendezvous at the high point of the orbit, bringing the two crafts back together. However, Mission Commander John Young considered what this rendezvous burn would do to the low point of the orbit and told Mattingly to wait until Mission Control could advise them. The advisement was to perform the rendezvous, and for a period of time, Young and Duke thought they weren't going to land on the moon. They waited for 2 hours while Houston diagnosed the issues, and at hour 102 of the mission, were given a go to perform the landing. The timeline of the mission had shifted a little, but Apollo 16 still performed and still succeeded in all of its goals. Harrison Schmidt's allergies. First of all, Jack's last name is misspelled on this iceberg, and I'm sorry for that. Second, what do you think Jack discovered he was allergic to? Not a lot of options on an Apollo mission. He was allergic, it turned out, to the lunar regolith. After their first EVA, Jack and Jean returned to the lunar module and took off their helmets. Immediately upon doing so and breathing in the moon dust, Jack's nose became swollen and he had trouble breathing. It was immediately apparent to Cernan, as it was bad enough that it had changed the sound of Jack's voice. By the fourth time he had to inhale it, the effects weren't so bad, but still noticeable. After getting home, Schmidt noticed a flight surgeon have the same reaction he did while taking the suits out of the command module, such a bad reaction in fact that he had to stop what he was doing and take a moment to recover. Theirs and Schmidt's case have become a case study into health effects caused by lunar regolith, and will likely be key to finding solutions during the Artemis program. It's a dangerous, desolate, and dusty world up there on the moon. Radioactive switches. Would it surprise you to know that the tips of every single switch inside the Apollo LEM was just a little bit radioactive? Well, they were. Why? So that the astronauts could see them. The flight-ready switch tips were installed very late in the assembly sequence to minimize exposure, but were made with radioluminescent material encased in clear plastic. Basically, they were glow-in-the-dark, allowing for them to be found in less than ideal lighting conditions. They posed little risk to the crew unless they happened to break, which they did before the launch of Apollo 11. During some panel rework, the plastic tips of several switches were compromised and radiation spread throughout the LM's interior, requiring a significant cleanup effort. Further rules were put in place regarding their handling after this incident. Alan Shepard on Apollo 13. You may remember in the Apollo 13 film that Jim Lovell states he has been moved to Apollo 13's prime crew because, quote, Al Shepard's ear infection flared up.
Al Shepard's ear infection has flared up. We've all been bumped up to the prime crew of Apollo 13.
This isn't quite what happened. Alan Shepard, the first American in space, did have an inner ear problem. However, a new surgery was developed to treat this in 1969, and Shepard was restored to full flight status in May of that year. As a result, Deke Slayton put Shepard down to command Apollo 13. However, due to his inexperience, Apollo 13 would have only been Shepard's second spaceflight, and the inexperience of the other two crew members, Stuart Roosa and Edgar Mitchell, Slayton instead asked for the crews of Apollo 14 and Apollo 13 to switch. Shepard and the others would fly on Apollo 14, giving them extra time to train, while Jim Lovell and his team would fly Apollo 13. The two crews expected there to be little difference between the two missions, but we already know that Apollo 13 was a very, very different Apollo mission. LEM telescope. Assuming I wasn't just referring to the alignment optical telescope used for navigation, this would refer to the Apollo telescope mount on Skylab. Another part of the Apollo applications program, the telescope mount was built essentially out of leftover LEM hardware. It doesn't really look like it anymore, but when originally conceived, the plan was to build the telescope mount directly out of a LEM ascent stage. Grumman proposed that the telescope could be a free flyer, occasionally separating from the orbital workshop and going off to do observations on its own. It could be crewed or operated remotely from Skylab. Having it be free flying would increase stabilization periods and allow for higher pointing accuracy for stellar targets. In the end, the telescope mount we did get was the only other item to survive the demise of the Apollo applications program aside from Skylab itself. Apollo 14 LEM abort switch. Another one of those many small but almost very bad failures that show the difficulty and perseverance required to make the Apollo program a success. After Apollo 14 had reached lunar orbit and the LEM was separated, the astronauts were preparing to initiate their descent. The guidance computer suddenly received 4 back-to-back errant abort commands. Basically, the computer was being told to abort the mission, but nobody had told the computer to do that, and they didn't know why the command was being given. If they couldn't get it fixed and the abort command occurred during the descent would automatically be reversed and the landing wouldn't occur. Originally planning to simply deactivate the abort as soon as it was activated, a better solution was proposed and implemented by Don Iles, MIT programmer who had worked on the flight software. He devised a set of instructions for the astronauts to enter into the computer which would convince it that it was already in abort mode, but that the procedures for that abort had already happened. At this point, the computer would simply relax, believing it was at the end of an abort procedure that never happened. It worked. Apollo 14's landing was, of course, a complete success. Joseph Shay on Apollo 1. Shay was the manager of the Apollo Spacecraft Program Office in 1963 and was butting heads with a lot of people. He was very dissatisfied with NASA's relationship with North American aviation, whom he saw as undisciplined and ineffective. He was partly responsible for pushing the idea of all-up testing the Saturn V as one unit, rather than the incremental approach preferred by Wernher von Braun and others. His position of resolving differences within NASA and between NASA and its contractors naturally brought criticism to him, and this criticism, though he brushed it off, led to an eventual buildup of stress. And then Apollo 1 happened. Though not entirely happy with the changes and rate of updates to the spacecraft, it ended up passing its review. The crew, unhappy with this decision, presented Shay with this joke portrait, on the back of which was written, "It isn't that we don't trust you, Joe, but this time we've decided to go over your head." Shay landed at KSC less than 5 hours after the fire. He threw himself into the investigation, working 80-hour weeks, the stress taking its toll on him. Struggling with sleep, he ended up turning to barbiturates and alcohol to help himself cope, and eventually others began to notice his deteriorating mental state. He was asked to take a voluntary leave of absence, but he refused and threatened to resign instead. As a compromise, he agreed to see a psychiatrist, but Joe was a very witty man, and convinced the psychiatrist that he was fine, although he clearly wasn't. One of his friends described him as ready to kill himself at the height of all the tension. Realizing they needed a more direct approach, Shay was reassigned to NASA headquarters to serve as George Mueller's deputy in the Office of Manned Spaceflight. 6 months later, he left NASA, saying, quote, "I don't understand why, after everything I had done for the program, I was the only one that was removed. That's the end of the program for me." Shay ended up becoming the vice president at the Polaroid Corporation and was never called to testify before Congress regarding the Apollo 1 fire, which was the real reason for his reassignment in the first place. Cock rocket. Another Scott Manley contribution, this simply refers to the large amount of low-tech hand-built parts that went into the construction of the Saturn V, specifically how the command module's heat shield was constructed with cock guns. The shield's honeycomb structure contained 370,000 individual cells to be filled with resin, and in the 1960s, the only way to fill those cells properly was by hand, one cell at a time. The workers who filled the cells became known as gunners and were trained for 2 weeks before actually working on a capsule due to the delicate and critical nature of their work. MQF lost at fish hatchery. You've probably seen this photo of Nixon speaking to the Apollo 11 astronauts behind a barrier. They're inside the Mobile Quarantine Facility, or MQF, a modified Airstream trailer that the astronauts were housed in for a period of time after their return from the moon. Because these missions were so unprecedented, it was unknown if the astronauts might accidentally return some kind of bacteria or other contagion from the lunar surface, so they needed to be kept isolated and washed for any signs of contamination. There were 4 MQFs built, for Apollos 11, 12, 13, and 14, though the one for 13 wasn't actually used. After Apollo 14, it had been proven that the moon was sterile and the quarantine procedure was retired. 3 of the trailers are on display in museums, though the Apollo 13 one is currently MIA. It was used by the USDA for some time, but its current location is unknown, just like, for a long time, MQF-002 used for Apollo 12. MQF-002 went on a bit of a journey after its use in the Apollo program. It was first transferred to the CDC, where it was stored for years before being handed off to the US Geological Survey. They then transferred the trailer to a fish hatchery that they ran in Marion, Pennsylvania. In 1998, the Pennsylvania Department of Conservation and Natural Resources took control of the hatchery, and therefore the trailer. There it was repurposed several times. First, it was used for housing for graduate students doing research for the US Fish and Wildlife Service. Later, it sat under a shed for over a decade, used only for storage. Oddly enough, the owners of the hatchery knew what it was, but NASA didn't know it was there. In fact, they had received a false report that it had been lost in a fire in Georgia, so they stopped looking for it. However, in 2007, the US Space and Rocket Center in Huntsville, Alabama, became aware of it and obtained the trailer, performed a complete restoration on it, and put it on display where it remains to this day. John Young learns about the Space Shuttle. As mentioned in the previous part, John Young was the pilot for STS-1, the very first Space Shuttle flight, alongside Robert Crippen in 1981. It was a landmark flight, as the Space Shuttle remains to this day the only crewed spacecraft to make its first orbital test flight with crew on board. There exists a curious overlap between space programs and a display of the amount of R&D time the shuttle underwent that occurs during Apollo 16. In 1972, 9 years before the shuttle flew its first flight, John Young and Charlie Duke were on the surface of the moon. Having just raised the flag, they were taking turns posing and saluting for photos. Mission Control interjected.
Good again. One for you. Okay, wait a minute, one more. This looks like a good time for some good news here. The House passed a space budget yesterday, 277 to 60, which includes a vote for the shuttle. Wonderful. Wonderful. Tony, again, I'll say it with that salute. I'm proud to be an American. I'll tell you, what a program, and what a place, and what an experience. Yeah, and I'll say it too. So am I. The country needs that shuttle mighty bad. You'll see.
It's interesting that while the Apollo program was coming to a close, the shuttle program was being granted funding, and the same man would be present for both of these historic events. John Young really did have a storied career. As an addendum, I'd like to show this photo taken at the launch site prior to Apollo 16's liftoff. While the second-to-last Apollo Saturn V sits on the launch pad in the distance, a mostly complete model of the space shuttle sits on a table. While the design of the orbiter itself clearly hasn't been finished, the arrangement of side-mounting the orbiter to an external fuel tank and 2 boosters had been finalized at this point. 9 years before the first shuttle would ever fly. Pete Conrad's hat. Hell yeah. Pete Conrad, Apollo 12, was a big fan of hats. All kinds of hats. He collected them, and he had the idea to bring one to the moon. It was designed by Uli Lotzman, who was actually a dental technician who had an amateur love of space travel and ended up working closely with the crew of Apollo 12, including design of the iconic, almost flown cap that, according to Conrad, must have never been approved for flight. Would have been pretty cool, though. Bezos raised an F1 engine. This is true. A man you may have heard of, Jeff Bezos, CEO of Amazon and Blue Origin, also runs something called Bezos Expeditions, something he uses for managing his personal investments. One of those investments involved finding and raising from the depths of the oceans the discarded remains of Saturn V first-stage engines used in the Apollo program. The team responsible for conservation of the recovered engines focused on preserving most of them as they were when they were found, though they did need to remove corrosion so that they would survive on display. After careful examination, it was revealed that one of the engine sets recovered had serial numbers tying them to the most important Apollo flight, Apollo 11. The others are from the following flight, Apollo 12. So, thanks Jeff, appreciate that. CEO, entrepreneur, born in 1960... Alright, I'm sorry. Michael Collins' Guinness record. Since Guinness World Records tend to be pretty silly, you might think it would be for loneliest man in the world. However, Al Warden gets that one because he was furthest away from the Earth at the height of his orbit around the far side of the moon. Collins' record is for the first spacewalk between spacecraft. On Gemini 10 in 1966, Collins exited the Gemini spacecraft with a tether and handheld zip gun and crossed the 3-meter gap between it and the Agena target vehicle. He retrieved a micrometeorite collector from the target vehicle before returning. I'll be honest, I don't know why this has to be a Guinness record, it's just a record. It's another first in space, another one of those achievements that the USA began to accrue in the second act of the space race. And that finishes off those double-decker cheeseburgers. One more to go. Big thanks to Zoe716 on Twitter, who contributed a large number of the lower tier items and provided information and material for several items as well. Zoe is a wealth of spaceflight knowledge, and I highly recommend following her on Twitter for obscure spaceflight knowledge that you didn't know that you needed, as well as subscribing to the Perigee Aerospace channel, which she co-runs. Grissom's Lemon. Starting off with a sad one. We all know Virgil Gus Grissom was a member of the ill-fated Apollo 1 crew, in addition to being the second American in space on Liberty Bell 7, and second American to fly in space twice, preceded only by Joe Walker in the X-15. Shortly before the Apollo 1 disaster, in perhaps the saddest moment of Grissom's storied career, he somewhat predicted what was going to happen. We talked in the first part of this iceberg about the crew's feelings of the Apollo 1 spacecraft. This Block 1 version of the CM had a lot of issues, and Grissom in particular was very vocal about his dissatisfaction with what he believed to be a faulty spacecraft. Furthermore, the simulator they were using was not being modified in time with the ever-changing spacecraft, making it difficult for them to accurately train with it. According to a book called Starfall by Grissom's wife Betty and Henry Still, Grissom made his last stop at his home near the Cape on January 22nd and went straight to the backyard. There, he went to their citrus tree and plucked a large lemon off of it. When asked what he was doing, he told his wife that, quote, "I'm going to hang it on that spacecraft," before leaving. He affixed the lemon to a wire coat hanger and hung the coat hanger above the Apollo spacecraft simulator's door. If you don't know, the symbolism here is that a lemon is a term used for a shoddy product. If you went to a used car lot and bought a bad car, you got a lemon. 5 days later, Gus Grissom perished in the plugs out test of January 27th, and his warnings were finally taken seriously. Roosa's Moon Trees. Something to bring up the mood. Stuart Roosa, Apollo 14, had spent time in the U.S. Forest Service as a smoke jumper. This is someone who jumps out of a plane into a wildfire with a parachute as a first responder, a badass job that I didn't know existed until today. Because of this experience, when he was placed on the crew of Apollo 14, he was contacted by an old friend, Ed Cliff, chief of the Forest Service. Cliff asked if Roosa would be interested in bringing seeds to space, and he was, carrying approximately 2,000 tree seeds in his personal kit as he orbited the moon in the CSM. Upon return to Earth, the seeds were germinated, which turned out to be a very difficult process due to some of the seed bags bursting open during decontamination. After a year in a somewhat inadequate facility, the remaining seeds were sent to the Forest Service in Mississippi and California, and since they weren't all individually tracked and cataloged, it's unknown how many exist today, but there are dozens of known moon trees across the United States, usually with some manner of label to let people know of their importance. Some were even planted alongside normal seeds to see if there was any difference, notably there hasn't been, and while Stuart Roosa may have passed away in 1994, the trees he helped plant with seeds from space are thriving to this day. LM variants and derivatives. Much like the Saturn V, there were a lot of ideas to modify or improve the Apollo lunar module for different purposes, largely for follow-on lunar missions that sadly would never occur. One variant did occur. All of the Apollo J missions used the extended LM, which made changes to allow for an increased payload capacity, bringing more scientific equipment, and staying on the surface for up to 3 days. There were many more ideas, and we've already discussed one, the free-floating telescope, but let's do a brief overview. A lot of these were meant to be used in conjunction with one another for extended lunar missions. For instance, one could be modified into a shelter that would be launched and landed without crew and would lack an ascent stage to allow for more life support equipment and could support astronauts for up to 14 days. These astronauts would arrive via a stripped-down LM taxi, which was used strictly for landing and ascent. At the same time, an LM truck could land with them, carrying more supplies for the extended duration missions. A larger shelter called the Lunar Base Module would strip even more systems away to allow for enlarged crew compartments and bulkheads. There were other free-flying science LM ascent stage variants, such as the Lunar Reconnaissance Module that would lack an ascent engine but could rendezvous with the CSM periodically after doing observations of the Moon. At the end of the day, the extended LM is the only idea ever to see the real world, but we may always wonder what could have been, if not for Tricky Dick. LES Uranium. LES stands for Launch Escape System, which would be the tower that sits on top of the command module at the tip of the Saturn V, designed to fire a small rocket motor and carry the capsule away from a failing rocket in the case of an emergency. It was never used in a live flight, but would you believe that thing contained uranium? Of course you would. If the LM had radioactive switch tips, why wouldn't the escape tower have depleted uranium in addition to lead used for weights in the ballast compartment of the nose cone to ensure stability during abort and jettison? It's depleted uranium, as I said, so not a big deal, but boy, a lot of strange parts made up the rocket that took humans to the Moon. Apollo 14 docking failure. Guess how many attempts it took the Apollo 14 crew to do a successful transposition and docking? You'll never guess. It took a grand total of 6 attempts to finally lash the two crafts together.
Okay, Houston, we've hit it twice, and sure looks like we're closing fast enough. I'm going to back out here and try it again. Well, we better back off here and think about this one, Houston. Roger. We're unable to get a capture.
Why? Well, that took a lot of work to figure out. They never 100% confirmed what happened, but it seems the most likely explanation is that something got between the two ends of the mechanism. Some amount of leftover metal bits or tape or maybe even ice got caught in the middle and prevented the docking probe from fully latching. Thankfully, it had no effect on later docking attempts, and the mission went mostly smoothly from there. The joint landing proposal. It didn't necessarily have to be a race, you know. Well, honestly, it probably did. But there was a chance that sending humans to the Moon could have been a cooperative effort. In 1963, at the United Nations General Assembly, President Kennedy offered to mount a joint lunar program with the USSR, suggesting that the two superpowers both had unique capabilities that could be used in conjunction, a suggestion that caught pretty much everyone very off guard. Quote, "In a field where the United States and the Soviet Union have a special capability, space, there is room for a new cooperation, for further joint efforts," he said. "I include among these possibilities a joint expedition to the Moon." Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev rejected the proposal, but in 1997, his son Sergei told a news outlet that his father had second thoughts. While frightened that the United States would gain intel on Soviet missile programs, he also believed the Soviets could absorb some of the valuable American technology as well, as if that was like the entire point. However, at the same time, this notion would have to go through Congress, and in the late 1960s would have been virtually impossible. It was the Cold War, after all. In the end, the proposal died with Kennedy some 2 months later, both nations absolving to push forward with their independent and competing programs. CSM terrain landing. As we all know, the Apollo command module would always land in the water to minimize the forces of that sudden stop under the aid of 3 parachutes. These parachutes slowed the capsule's descent to around 25 feet per second, which would not bode well if the capsule were somehow forced to land on hard terrain. However, as early as 1963, NASA was considering it as an emergency possibility just in case everything were to go horribly wrong. They performed numerous drop tests onto terrain and ended up refining the design to try and mitigate the force of a landing as much as they possibly could. The capsule descended through the air at an angle, and the leading edge that touched first was designed as a kind of crumple zone, absorbing some of the force of the impact. There were further improvements suggested by NASA contractors to create a pneumatic impact attenuation system specifically for terrain landings, but these were never put into practice. At the end of the day, the focus was put on making sure that the CM always hit the water, even waiting for launch conditions that would blow one out past the shore if an abort occurred early in the ascent. It was deemed overall that a terrain landing was very likely not survivable. The AGC source code. Sometime in, I'm gonna say 2016 because the 2019 article I found said, quote, a few years ago, the source code for the Apollo guidance computer was released to the public over the internet. People began poring over it, using a simulator provided by the releaser called the Virtual AGC page, digging deep into the systems and how they worked. They uncovered a lot of interesting stuff, too much to go over here. For one thing, a file dedicated to engine ignition was titled Burn Baby Burn. Another dedicated to the keyboard and display system was titled Pinball Game Buttons and Lights. There was a treasure trove of comments left by the developers, which if you know anything about programming are sections of text that are made to be ignored by the actual program and exist only to inform other developers about how the code works. At the same time as the comments contain useful instructions, they also contain little jokes. A hello there, a goodbye come again soon, a Wizard of Oz reference, an entire paragraph from Shakespeare's Henry VI, and a lot more. It's a real rabbit hole, maybe worth coming back to one day. Or you can have a look at it yourself. It's free, it's public domain, and anyone can just download and look at the source code that took humans to the moon. What a time to be alive. Lunar Surface Rendezvous. When Apollo was being planned, there were three primary methods of performing a lunar landing that were taken into consideration. The first was direct descent, an extra powerful and extra complicated one-shot spacecraft that would be launched into orbit, land as one piece, then take off again as one piece before returning to Earth. The second, Earth Orbit Rendezvous, required building a moon-bound spacecraft in Earth orbit using several launches and dockings. This was effectively the early Soviet lunar program. The third was the chosen method, Lunar Orbit Rendezvous, referring to the LM ascent stage's return to lunar orbit to dock with the CSM. However, there was a fourth, often forgotten option, as it was kinda silly, but interesting, Lunar Surface Rendezvous. Here's how it would work. First, you launch a surveyor-derived uncrewed spacecraft to the moon. It's used as a survey and marking spacecraft. Next, you land a couple more spacecraft, a refueling tanker, a cargo vehicle, and finally, a one-way lander. When the astronauts arrive, they then go to the cargo vehicle and refueling tanker and build their way home. That's right, finish assembly of an ascent and return to Earth vehicle. In the end, obviously, this was deemed as too complicated and too expensive. Apollo 10 LM software. So we've got the AGC source code, but that software changed throughout the program, most notably between Apollos 10 and 11. Snoopy, the LEM for Apollo 10, was one of a kind, and its software only existed in one place, Abort it, currently orbiting around the Sun. So what do? Well, obviously, you recreate it on your own from scratch, or at least that's what software engineer Mike Stewart did. And this is no easy feat. Let me begin by pointing out that the AGC is written in assembly language. I took 2 years of computer programming in college, and I never touched or even heard of assembly language before I learned about the AGC. And don't say that's because these courses only teach modern languages, they don't. I learned COBOL, okay? How Stewart recreated the Apollo 10 code is very clever. He had access to an earlier version of the software, what he called almost but not quite the version that flew on Apollo 10. In addition, he also had access to the version of the software directly following Apollo 11. So, somewhere in the middle, the Apollo 10 code could be derived. He made a video describing the process of writing the code, a very slow and complicated process of checking and rechecking and cross-referencing with available data and then rechecking for a 5,000th time, but he finally did it. For the full story, watch this video in the top right corner. CM reuse/refurbishment. You might think this was an early idea of the Apollo program, and while it was certainly briefly considered in the early days, the idea of refurbishing and reusing an Apollo command module was actually an idea most talked about in the 1980s. With the Space Shuttle program just beginning, Rockwell PR began to float the idea of a reusable Apollo CM for use as a rescue ship on Space Station Freedom, which would eventually become the International Space Station. There were numerous problems with this, primarily that the Apollo CM was specifically designed to be intentionally damaged during re-entry and landing. This was part of that impact attenuation system we talked about, completely deforming its structure into its crumple zones. Furthermore, water landings presented the infiltration of contaminants that would slowly corrode the electronics, actuators, and seals. The RCS thrusters were built with a firing lifetime in mind, meaning that they would also need to be replaced. The final nail in the coffin is that capsule reuse isn't very cost efficient. Even if they're reused once, twice, or even 5 times, they will eventually need to be replaced, meaning that the ability to build new ones need to be retained, which is not a cheap process. While more modern capsules such as the SpaceX Dragon capsules can be reused, these too have a shelf life and significant refurbishment costs, if only because they land in salt water. Luna 15. The only time, to my knowledge, that 2 lunar missions were in progress at the same time. While Apollo 11 was finishing its spacewalk, Luna 15, an uncrewed Soviet probe, was beginning its descent to the lunar surface. This was the lunar program's second attempt to return lunar soil back to Earth, launched 3 days before Apollo 11 in, honestly, a feeble attempt to strip away some of the prowess of the first crewed lunar landing. However, it never quite got the chance. In the same spirit as more recent uncrewed attempts, Luna 15 crashed into the surface of the moon hours before Apollo 11 lifted off of the same surface. Transmissions ceased 4 minutes after it began its deorbit burn, with the general conclusion that it most likely crashed into the side of a lunar mountain. Many people see it as a symbolic representation of the conclusion of the space race. While the United States were setting foot on the moon, the Soviet Union was crashing into it. Wacky AAP concepts. This is the one item on this iceberg that I've realized shouldn't really be here. We've already discussed what the Apollo Applications Program was, a program to develop science-based human spaceflight missions using leftover Apollo hardware. In many ways, it was an era of NASA throwing spaghetti at the wall and seeing what sticks, but the burner is broken and only a few strands of spaghetti ended up being cooked. Most AAP concepts were unrealistic, dangerous, and had limited scientific returns, like some of the ones we've talked about, such as the Apollo Venus flyby. The reason it shouldn't be on the iceberg is because we've already discussed probably half a dozen AAP concepts already, and I would say most of them were pretty wacky. So for this item, I'll simply add another concept, the last proposal. Standing for lunar applications of a spent S4B stage, the proposal was to modify the third stage of the Saturn V to be able to land on the moon. Why? What would it carry? What would you do with it? Well, the proposal never really got that far. The Douglas IBM team behind the proposal provided very few details. When asked, for instance, how astronauts in bulky spacesuits would climb the 60 feet to reach the top of the last vehicle, they offered only vague suggestions such as cargo and handling equipment. What kind of payloads would it carry? Also vague. There are a few sketches, such as this more elaborate version of a lunar rover, or this lunar flying unit for use by an astronaut. I'm not sure how I feel about this one, standing so close to engines that would be shooting sharp lunar regolith into the air around you. Don't know about that. Another option included creating a wet lab out of the spent stage, and we've discussed before the many difficulties and challenges of wet labs. Perhaps LASS might have offered more solutions to all of the challenges it presented, but unfortunately it would remain on paper to the end of time, like most of the AAP. The Apollo Spacecraft Feasibility Study. Conducted in 1960 to 1961, this is basically how the Apollo program's vehicles got their start. With the success of Project Mercury, NASA needed to plan a multi-crewed spacecraft that could be used for space stations and lunar missions. You see, at first, Apollo didn't have a specific goal. It simply stood for whatever came next in the world of crewed spaceflight. Once Kennedy committed the USA to a crewed lunar landing, the program was given focus, and many of the study designs were discarded in favor of working on the command module and designing the process of a lunar landing. Some of these designs were pretty out there, a lot like the AAP. Here's General Dynamics' proposal for a circumlunar mission, which makes absolutely no sense to me, but is better than Conrad, who apparently selected a lifting body for return from the moon, which seems like a bad idea at those re-entry speeds. GE made a proposal that actually somewhat resembled the Soviet Soyuz, featuring a bullet-shaped descent module flanked by a conical mission module and a cylindrical propulsion module. They wouldn't be the only ones to eventually adopt this design. China's Shenzhou spacecraft and India's upcoming crewed orbital vehicle both use designs very similar to the three-piece tried-and-true Soyuz. In November of 1961, the study concluded when North American Aviation were awarded the Command and Service Module contract. At the time, it was assumed that the landing would be achieved by direct descent, meaning significant design changes were needed when Lunar Orbit Rendezvous was selected, not the least of which was a method to dock the CSM to another spacecraft. By 1963, the process was more or less sorted out, and Grumman had been contracted to construct the other half of the mission, the lunar module. Duke's family portrait. Our last entry of oddities and personal items left on the moon, Charlie Duke left a portrait of himself, his wife, and their 2 children on the moon. On the back of the photo was written, quote, "This is the family of astronaut Charlie Duke from planet Earth who landed on the moon on April 20th, 1972. Not much more to it than that. Just a nice family photo sitting in the lunar regolith waiting for an alien to pick it up and say, "Aw." At least we actually have photos of this one on the surface. It seems somewhat appropriate that the final item on the Apollo iceberg is "Are you a turtle?" given the thematic role turtles have played in my channel's history.
I like turtles.
This was the question posed to NASA Public Affairs Officer and Voice of Mission Control Paul Haney by Walt Cunningham, who was aboard the Apollo CSM on Apollo 7. He posed the question by holding up this cue card and another with Deke Slayton's name on it. Slayton, who wasn't present, recorded a response for Cunningham, which was the correct response. Paul Haney, however, did not answer the question, and as a result, was forced to buy several people a drink. You see, the question refers to the Ancient and Honorable Order of Turtles, a drinking club for American World War II pilots. According to the club's tradition, a member must answer this question by stating, "You bet your sweet ass I am." Haney, however, hadn't wanted to curse live over the radio, so as a result, he had to buy the other members present a drink. The cue card remained at Paul Haney's home until he passed away in 2009. Prior to his home, it had been in the Air and Space Museum, and while I can't find confirmation, it's possible that it's been returned there now. And there it is. The complete Apollo iceberg, explained, I hope, in sufficient detail. This has been a monumental undertaking. The first thing I need to say is that this is not actually complete. There is no complete Apollo iceberg, because there's simply too much information. While creating this, I opened it up to suggestions for about a week or two, eventually coming up with what I called version 0.9. However, after closing submissions, I received a mountain more of them, and then more, and then more, and then more. In fact, it never really stopped. Even after releasing parts 1 and 2, people were suggesting more additions, but there simply wasn't space. There had to be an upper limit somewhere, and so I chose where it was, after I jokingly released version 8.9.9.8.2.1 and ended up with the final product. But there truly is so much more to Project Apollo than it would seem. It is a vast ocean that has been lost to time, and if you go looking, you'll surely find things that were not covered here. By way of a for instance, I found that landable S4B proposal a couple days before writing these words. Thank you all so much for going on this journey with me. It was exhausting, stressful, and entirely worth it. It was one small step for Neil, but one giant leap into a world of space history obscurity for an unqualified nobody like me. Thank you again, and I'll see you in the next one.